Romantics, Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt. It's hard to imagine, but about half a dozen of the greatest composers of all time were born in the space of just 4 years, between 1809 and 1813. Why was this Romantic period so magical, so enduring? Maybe the music is trying to tell us something. In Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu, he gives us a turbulent storm in C-sharp minor. But this stormy theme gets transformed. It turns into this meltingly lovely melody in D-flat major. Now the storm returns again later, but what does this melody in D-flat mean, and why is it so irresistible? It turns out that the key of D-flat had a very special meaning for Chopin. When a woman caught his fancy, he would use this key as a coded message for romance. He even told one of his fans that she was now pregnant with his compositions. You see, after Chopin left his native Poland, he became an overnight sensation with his set of variations on a theme from Mozart's opera Don Giovanni. One German critic got completely carried away and wrote a 10-page review finding all sorts of hidden meanings in the notes. When Chopin read this, he said he could die from laughter at the man's imagination. In a letter to a friend, Chopin wrote, "In the fifth bar of the Adagio, the critic declares that Don Giovanni kisses Zerlina on the D flat. Now, where do you suppose her D flat is?" Well, we don't know who Chopin had in mind when he wrote the Fantasy Impromptu, but we do know who he had in mind when he wrote his little waltz in D flat major. It was for the Countess Delfina Potocka. Now, I would assume that most women were quite flattered to be honored with a piece in D flat. But if tender, lingering romance was what Chopin conveyed with that beautiful melody in the Fantasy Impromptu, how do you think the Countess Potocka felt about his dedication to her of his minute waltz? Now that you know what the minute waltz in D flat is about, let's see if you can keep a straight face. Chopin was an overnight sensation in Paris, and one fateful day, his good friend, the great virtuoso Franz Liszt, introduced him to the novelist George Sand. Now George, whose real name was Aurora, was perhaps the world's first great feminist. She couldn't get published as a woman, so she assumed a man's name, wore men's clothes, and seemed to talk endlessly about the glories of her two favorite subjects, which were free love and socialism. As you can see, she was a woman well ahead of her time, and I'd like to think if she'd been born a bit later, she might have made a very fine mayor of my hometown of San Francisco. Truth be told, it wasn't exactly love at first sight. Chopin wrote home to Poland that he found George to be a most odd-looking man. And he wasn't alone in this. Fortunately, their good friend Gustave Flaubert, the great author of Madame Bovary, decided to set the record straight and came to George's defense. And he wrote the following: "One has to know George the way I know George to appreciate how much of the truly feminine there is in this great man. Well, despite all the scandal and confusion, George Sand was to be the love of Chopin's life and the support and inspiration for many of his greatest masterpieces. As fate would have it, Chopin would spend the rest of his life based in France as Poland fought for its independence from Russia. As a result, his Polish dances, the Polonaise, sometimes took on a military character. In his final heroic Polonaise, we seem to begin with the cannons being rolled onto the battlefield. Next, we meet the heroes of the battle, the officers. Then we meet the real heroes. We hear a cannon shot and the infantry advances on foot. Now we're ready for the cavalry charge. We hear the hooves of the horses as they begin to stampede and the bugle call. A huge battle ensues, and afterwards, Chopin portrays for us the tragedy of war, all the lost souls. But this is a romantic piece, and we're off to a triumphal ending. So let's roll out the heavy artillery for Chopin's heroic Polonaise in A flat. Like Chopin, his friend Franz Liszt was dedicated to showcasing the music of his native land, in this case Hungary, but also dedicated to a life of romance. So much so, in fact, that Papa Liszt warned young Franz that someday women would be the ruin of him. Little did Liszt's father know it would be the other way around. Liszt was a sensation. For decades, women would fight for possession of anything he touched, his used napkins or cigar butts, even to drink his leftover tea. If they could, they'd squeeze in close to him to try to steal hairs from his head. Well, it all sounds like great fun, but at the age of 60, Liszt finally met a young lady who would not take no for an answer, Olga Janina. Olga was a Cossack horsewoman from Ukraine, a talented and ambitious pianist whose first piano teacher had died when her pet tiger ate him. She was 18 years old and determined to make Liszt understand the joys of monogamy. When this failed, as it always did, she threatened him with a poison-tipped dagger she kept by her side. This may have kept him in line for a while, but when he returned to his womanizing ways, she upped the ante and came after him with a revolver. When this failed, in desperation, she decided to end both their lives. But she demanded a nice romantic dinner first. She then produced 2 poison pills, one for each of them, but proceeded to swallow both the pills herself, probably in a futile attempt to make Liszt feel guilty. Well, she did eventually recover from her coma, and she decided that the life of a musician was probably not for her. As for Franz Liszt, he lived his musician's life in Technicolor, and it's only appropriate that his most beloved piece, the Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, was immortalized in both a Bugs Bunny and a Tom and Jerry cartoon. Liszt celebrated the musicians of Hungary by adapting their folk tunes for his Hungarian rhapsodies. So let's enjoy the gypsy music of Budapest, along with Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd.
you.